Hi guys, welcome back. Now we're going to be starting with barriers to entry and exit. Now we have already studied before as well that monopolies, when they make abnormal profits in the short run, these abnormal profits are able to sustain them. They are able to persist in the long run because the entry of new firms is actually blocked, right? Now what actually blocks them? What makes the new firms not enter? That is what is the topic of today's video, and they're known as barriers to entry, and there are barriers to exit as well, and we'll see that. But barriers to entry, guys, is basically that is what is actually giving the monopoly, right? The ability. So it's the ability that give that monopoly the ability to maintain their monopoly position, to maintain their market power, to maintain their monopoly power in the long run. And that allows those monopolists to sort of maintain their profits in the long run as well. Now, by definition, what barriers to entry are, that barriers to entry, you will write that they are obstacles or they are impediments, right? Use these two words or either of them that prevents the new firms to enter, and they're called barriers to entry. Now, these barriers, students, could either be natural or they could be artificial. Artificial means they could be artificially created, right? And there are some barriers that are not created; they just exist naturally, and they are natural impediments, basically natural obstacles for new firms. And natural barriers usually happens when the cost of entry to the market is too high for the new firms, and there are various ways in which this cost of entry could be too high. Now, one of the natural barriers that actually exist is, and a very important barrier to entry, what deters the new firms to enter the market. So is basically the concept of economies of scale, or is in fact economies of scale. We know what economies of scale are when your cost per unit cost starts to fall as the firm is expanding its scale of output. Now, we know that a firm that is experiencing huge economies of scale. Now, monopolies are, since they are large firms, they experience huge, significant economies of scale. And because of that, they will experience significantly lower cost of production than a new firm that is trying to, enter. So let's say that if it does enters, so if that new firm enters the market, the thing is that what you need to write is that they will be easily priced out. Okay, they will be easily priced out by the monopolist, and they will not be able to compete with the large incumbent monopolist or the large incumbent firm. That is because obviously those that new firm will be lacking the ability to basically sort of grow to a similar size as that of a monopoly as quickly, right? So as a consequence, what's going to happen is that obviously it's a deterrent for the new firm. So fewer firms will enter the market, number one, and number two, the competition would be restricted, and the monopoly will be able to maintain its monopoly power and monopoly position in the market, right? And there's a diagram as well, which you can use in the exam, and it's a simple diagram. See, diagrams, I have several times mentioned before that the diagrams are made from the concept, right? The concept is not derived from the diagram. It's a diagram that is derived from the concept. So you see, you have two firms here. Firm A is established monopoly, while firm B is a potential rival that is looking to enter the market. It's, let's say, a smaller business. So you have output and cost on the vertical and the horizontal axis, and you see that this cost curve, for the average cost curve for firm B, if you see, the potential or the scope for economies of scale is very limited. That scope is exhausted at an output level of QA for firm B, right? So for a scale of output, that maximum MES for firm B, the MES, that is where all potential economies are exploited and exhausted, is at Q1, right? But if you look at firm A, that's a large monopoly. At Q1, the firm has not really exhausted all its economies of scale. It still has a lot of more potential for economies of scale to take place. The average cost curve is it's the unit cost keeps on declining for firm A over a much larger scale or range of output. So that itself is, again, shows that firm B can't really compete with firm A, obviously. At the same time, this diagram is also showing that for output level of Q1, the average cost for firm A is only AC1, while that of firm B is ACB. So this vertical distance is representing the difference in the average cost for both these firms, right? And it's clearly, we can see that at the same output level, firm A has a big cost advantage over the potential rival firm B. So you guys, you see, this is how economies of scale could, act as a natural barrier, preventing the entry of new firms, allowing the monopolies to maintain their monopoly power, right? And their monopoly position or the market power, basically. And you see, apart from that, there are other reasons as well. Obviously, we have studied the economies of scale in theory of supply chapter, and there are various economies of scale that large firms could benefit from ranging from purchasing economies to financial to managerial to marketing economies and a lot more, right? But apart from that, there are some other reasons as well that allows these large firms, large incumbent firms, this is the word that I'm using, large incumbent firms from, to sort of gain a bigger or gain more potential, or the fact that a lot of potential for economies of scale exist, and that is in the fact of learning economies of scale as well. Learning economies, now this is another term. This is actually used when you have been in the market for quite some time and you're an experienced player, you know the tricks of the trade. So you see, how to, in that sense, when you have the experience and you have made a lot of maybe mistakes in the past and you've learned from them, so you know how to improve the production process, you know how to reorganize production to be more efficient, you know how to eliminate the waste, you know how to reduce your input cost, you know how to use your factor mix in the most optimum way, how to optimize your production processes. So obviously you benefit from learning economies since you're a large incumbent firm as compared to a potential rival who is small in size and it's trying to enter and compete with you, right? Secondly, also large established business may sort of integrate as well, and especially they may integrate vertically, be it vertical backward or vertical horizontal, which could give them more power and control over not only raw material supplies as well as the supply chain that links your production process, your manufactured goods to the final consumer, right? And you see establishes businesses because they will vertically integrate. Like I said, they'll have more, and since they have now more control over the supply chain, it will give them cost savings, it will give them cost advantage. Also, these large incumbent firms also do have some degree of monopsony power, right? Monopsony power. Now monopsony power stands for buying power, and we're going to be seeing that in a separate video as well. But for now, you can understand that monopsony power is basically that large incumbent firms will have the market power also in terms of buying, that is buying power in the market, which will allow them to purchase raw material, or let's say component parts, or even perhaps labor resources as well, at a cheaper rate than a new firm that is coming in, right? So because you are a large buyer, definitely, right? So you have that power to get those advantages. So this is a monopsony power known as buying power. So use this word. So these are other reasons, and all of this will ultimately result in average cost going down and economies of scale to exist, and that is exactly what will prevent a new firm from entering the market, and it will allow the monopoly to maintain its monopoly position. The second, barrier to entry that you could also say is also a natural barrier is the high startup cost. Right, the high startup cost. So high startup costs, guys, can also act as a deterrent. Remember this, to use the word deterrent, for new firms to enter a market. It's an obstacle for new firms to enter a market. It's an impediment for new firms to enter a market because deciding new firm to enter a market who's sort of deciding to start. Who deciding to enter the market, and then instead that new firm might not enter and might set up its businesses or processes somewhere else instead of this market, where the risks are much lower, because here the risks are high because you already have a large monopoly there, and you want to compete with it and you can't, first of all, due to various reasons, and then you also know that the startup cost is high, so you don't want to take the risk of competing with a large monopoly and then investing so much capital into, and using that high startup infrastructure and then investing so much in it, and then there's a lot of uncertainty there whether you will be able to compete or not. So that high startup cost is also a deterrent. So as a consequence, what will happen, guys, is it follows that fewer firms will actually enter the market, and hence competition would be quite restricted. And especially there are some industries in which these production processes require large investment in capital, or let's say large research and development costs that will make new companies to enter the industry difficult. It will make it difficult for the new industries to enter and compete. For example, especially, so it's better that you give an example that will improve your analysis part, like steel industry, or let's say pharmaceutical, especially. So steel industry, pharmaceutical, and space transport as well. So at least, yeah. So I mean, now space transport, rarely, probably it might not click you at that time in the exam, but at least steel industry and pharmaceuticals is something which we all know that has a huge startup cost, right? And like as far as economies of scale is concerned, you let's say if you're saying that monopolies are very large and the new firms would be small, so even if you, like, for the sake of instant, you can, if you argue that maybe the new firm might start up as big as with a huge amount of capital, and they may start up and invest, and they may come up in they may start up with the same size as that of a monopolist, but it will still not have, despite that it may benefit from certain economies then in that case, but then it will still not have the economies that is coming from the expertise in the industry, especially the learning economies that I was talking about, especially the fact that the managerial economies that I'm talking about, the research and development economies that would be happening to large, that is relative, I mean pertinent to large incumbent firms. So all of that, and without an equal economies of scale. So it's not that you are benefiting from economies of scale, it's about that you need to benefit from equal economies of scale, right? Otherwise, so it's no point. And we can see that although this firm was also benefiting from economies of scale, but these economies of scale was relatively very small, that it could reduce the average cost to a very low extent, and then all that economies of scale was exhausted, and now the firm B can't really increase its output because it has reached its minimum point of its average cost, as compared to firm A that has a significant scope for economies of scale to happen over a large range of output. So you see, without the equal level of economies of scale, a new entrant to the industry knows that it will not be able to compete with the existing monopolist. The monopolist can't, the only thing the monopolist honestly has to do is to just reduce the price to the level of normal profits. It has to reduce the price to the level of normal profits, right? That is just equal the price. The monopolist reduces the price. The monopolist has the power to do that. It's a price maker. It can reduce the price and equal it to the level of average total cost. And in that case, obviously the monopolist would be making normal profits, but then the new firm's average cost is quite high. It can't really reduce the price to that extent. It will incur significant losses. And that is exactly that at the start of the video I used the term the monopoly will easily, those new firms will be easily priced out. So when you're saying they will be easily priced out, that is what it means. Because when monopolies are benefiting from significant economies of scale, they have the potential to reduce, that they can reduce the price as well, right? It's not that they will always charge high prices. They can reduce the prices. We'll see that in evaluation as well when we'll be discussing the fact that whether monopolies are always undesirable. Especially when you're benefiting from significant economies of scale, you do have that cost advantage. So monopolies, the only thing the monopoly will need to do is just to reduce the price to the level of normal profits, and then you easily price out the new firm, and he's out, and that new firm is out of the market. So, and in that case, at this level, if the monopoly has reduced the price to the level that it has equal to the monopoly's average total cost, then at this level the new entrant would be making losses, because you see ACA is the average cost of firm A, and if the monopoly charges the price of, let's say, P1, which is equal to ACA, So it would be making normal profits. But P1 is not would not be equal to ACB. In fact, ACB would be higher than P1. So the firm B would in that case be making losses, right? So that's what we're sort of talking about. So and so firm B will not be able to compete, right? It won't be able to even enter the monopoly industry in that case. It's lacking the economies of scale. You don't have to lack the economies of scale to compete with a monopoly. Either you have to be on that same level of economies of scale or you can't compete, right? So that acts as a huge deterrent then. Now let's look at the third barrier to entry, which is high sunk cost. So basically, high sunk cost. Okay, so sunk cost itself means we're talking about that money that has already been spent, and basically it cannot be recovered because that cost has already been incurred. That's what by definition sunk cost means, right? So in certain markets and industries, you have high levels of sunk cost because these are costs that you have already incurred and they're not recoverable. And when the firm, let's say, decides, if the firm, let's say, leaves the market, it exits the industry. So there's a huge cost that it will not be able to recover in the sense that it can't do anything with that cost. For example, let's say highly specialized machinery that was purposely made developed for that specific industry or plant, right? And the cost of advertising. So when you're exiting, you can't really sell that machinery. Neither you can recover your advertising costs because those costs and the cost of highly specialized machinery or highly specialist machinery has already been incurred. You have already paid for it, right? So firms knowing that they can't really recover it because it's sunk cost. So firms knowing that in this case leaving the industry will result in costs that are not recoverable. And I think that's enough deterrent. It's enough of a deterrent for the new firms not to enter the market in the first place, honestly. Consequently, it is obviously reducing competition in the market because due to the sunk cost risk involved here, that they will not be able to recover if they leave, right? And if those sunk costs are quite high, then in that case, obviously, it's enough risk for them to not enter the industry in the first place. And so so that's what sunk cost is. Apart from that, there is another barrier to entry which is quite interesting, and it brings us to the concept of natural monopoly. Natural monopoly. So basically, what exactly is a natural monopoly? Natural monopoly is a specific type of monopoly, as in it's a monopoly, but we're calling it natural monopoly because it has a certain feature involved in it that makes it that we have given the name. And it occurs because it could exist because of the nature of that market or nature of the industry, basically, where there are huge fixed costs, exuberant levels of fixed costs, like extraordinarily high fixed cost in production, huge fixed costs in production. And these costs are often associated with significant levels of cost of infrastructure and significant machinery that is needed to supply the product in the market. And industries where all these costs of infrastructure and machinery that is involved includes industries like gas, because there's a huge level of gas infrastructure required, electricity networks, railway track network that so in terms of railways, there's a significant cost of infrastructure. So potential natural monopoly could exist there. And let's say in industries such as water supply, because obviously the water supply infrastructure that includes the piping work that is involved. So all these infrastructure and the machinery required to actually run the industry is exuberantly high, and there is huge fixed costs involved in production, right? So that means that when you say that when you have this presence of a huge fixed cost, which includes a significant cost of infrastructure and machinery that is needed to supply the market, then the firm in that case that is producing and supplying that industry is a natural monopoly. In fact, you know, um, it's actually beneficial for other firms not to enter the industry in such an industry, and we'll talk about that. So, firstly, so you see, the first firm that is actually in the market that is supplying this in this industry, right? So the first firm in the market, it has an overwhelming cost advantage. Why? Because of the massive economies of scale that can actually be exploited. So there's a huge potential of massive economies of scale that could be exploited. That is, the firm could, again, when you're saying that there's a massive economies of scale that could be exploited, it means that the firm could produce huge levels of output, still reducing its average cost. Because once the long run average cost takes a U-turn, diseconomies of scale start rising. In that case, then it will result in, obviously your average cost would start rising. You won't be efficient then. So when you're saying that there's a massive economies of scale that could be exploited, it means that you have an overwhelming cost advantage. You could increase your output to a significant extent to still benefit from a falling average cost. And you see, given the height of this fixed cost, given the fact that there are exuberant levels of fixed cost involved, then in that case, if the firm just keeps on increasing the output, I mean, the average cost per unit would start going down because because the level of fixed cost is so high that those fixed costs would just keep on spreading over a larger range of output, reducing the average cost each time the firm increases its scale of production. So in that sense, it follows that, given, like I said, given those huge fixed costs, minimizing the firm's average cost will require a great or huge quantity of output to be produced, which is actually a good thing. That implies that the long run average cost curve for a natural monopolist basically will be downward sloping over a much larger range of output. It's going to slope downwards like this over a much larger range of output. So downward sloping is this as well, but then this is not, but it slopes downwards from here till here only for this much range of output, right? This is what I'm saying. But if it's sloping downwards for a much larger range of output, that's actually a good thing. Then, if it's going to slope downwards over a much larger range of output than a normal monopoly, is long run average cost curve would, with the minimum efficient scale point occurring at a very large level of output. So you see, look at the minimum average scale occurring at a very large level of output. So there is this much level of output that could be produced. Now on a scale, on a diagram, this looks like a very small distance, but in real sense, this would actually represent a huge scale of output being produced by this particular industry to achieve that MES basically, which is actually a good thing, showing that there's so much scope for economies of scale to be exploited over and to increase and for the fact that your output scale could just keep on going up without diseconomies occurring, and MES would even occur at a very large or high level of scale of output. So there's enormous potential for economies of scale when there's a natural monopoly market, and this itself is a deterrent for a new firm, and I'll tell you why. Because the thing is that it makes, and like I said, diseconomies would occur after a huge range of output. And what would that range be? On a diagram, it can't even be shown. Maybe it would be an output level over somewhere over here. So the long run average cost will just keep on, reducing before it, takes a flat shape, and then before it moves up. But then we don't need to show that. We need to just express it verbally by saying that diseconomies would occur after a huge range of output, and honestly so large range that we can't even show on our diagram. So we are sort of trying to project this theory or this model, and that is the reason why when you're seeing the diagram for for a natural monopolist, the long run average cost just is the diagrams are made to in this shape because the long run average cost is falling, and it just keeps on falling. So the diagram really doesn't, and that is why the long run average cost doesn't take a U-turn, because that's exactly what we're trying to show over here, that we don't really know what that range of output is, but whatever it will be after a huge range, right? And technically we can't even show that on this diagram. So what I was saying was, yeah. So what I was saying was that if that's the case, then honestly, it doesn't make any sense. Neither it makes any economic sense, neither it makes any rational sense for new firms to compete with an incumbent natural monopolist. Why? Because of the economies of scale differential is so great that the incumbent firm will simply price the new firm out of the market, either using predatory pricing or any short-term pricing strategy that will easily outcompete, the newer firm, driving them out of the market. So it doesn't make any sense for firms to compete with an incumbent natural monopolist because of like I said, because of the economies of scale differential being so great that the incumbent firm will simply price the new firm out, right? So this is and this is again a natural barrier, right? So natural monopoly, so an industry that is governed by a natural monopolist, if the industry has a natural monopolist, as in the market is being supplied or the by a natural monopolist, so it doesn't make any rational and economic sense for new firms to compete. Why? Because firstly, they will not be able to compete because the natural monopolist will simply wipe them out, price them out, and also that competition is not desirable. It doesn't make rational sense to compete. Why? Because competition is going to reduce the growth potential for businesses, for actually both these businesses as well. Because there's a huge potential for economies of scale to be exploited by the natural monopolies. With competition, this potential will not be fully exploited, right? So technically what we're saying is that it will reduce the growth potential of the businesses, right? With huge economies of scale which could have been exploited not being exploited fully, right? And you see these natural monopolies are in industries like I mentioned about gas, electricity, railway track, and water supply. Now these are industries that are socially desirable and used for public welfare, public interest, that are basically used by the general public, right? And not only the upper rich people travel, or the upper income groups travel or use or consume these services, but a lot of these services are consumed by lower income groups. So it's actually socially desirable as well that the natural monopolist's average cost is as low as possible, and the natural monopolist is given the liberty actually to fully exploit the economies of scale over here, so that the prices for for these goods could be as low as possible, because these prices also, because the industry's nature of the good is such that it has a social, it's consumed by lower income groups as well, so there's a public welfare desirable element attached to it as well. So there's no point in competing with the natural monopolies. That's what we are trying to say. Is that such although competition is good, it's healthy, but a competition with a natural monopolist is not desirable, because, like I said, already there's a huge infrastructure cost that is involved to set up here, right? And if the natural monopolist has already done it, if let's say firm A is a natural monopolist and firm A has a first mover advantage, he was the first one to enter this industry and started supplying water or maybe electricity or gas, then let him do it. Let firm A do it only, and let firm A maximum exploit economies of scale, which will benefit the firm as well, and will also benefit the general public as well, right? So like I said, competition will reduce that growth potential for businesses, so that huge economies of scale that could potentially be exploited will now not be fully exploited, which will obviously cause productive inefficiency, because firm A will not be able to operate on its minimum long run average cost, or maybe achieve MES, because like I said, competition is reducing that growth potential for businesses, and obviously the natural monopolist then in that case will not be able to fully exploit the economies of scale that it could have. And and this is actually leading to wasteful duplication of resources. Wasteful duplication of resources is the word that I used. Wasteful duplication. Wasteful duplication of resources. Wasteful duplication of resources, right? Because you entered the market, you invested, you wasted the resources, because you could have used those resources into something else which could have been more productive socially and economically, and now you're out of that market because the natural monopolist priced you out of the market. You've wiped you out of of that market, and now you are just driven out of the market. Leaving the resources idle because now you can't really. Um, there's the element of sunk cost is involved as well, because that infrastructure investment that has been made cannot probably be sold off, right? So again, like I said, it just leaves the resources idle there. So the resources have technically been wasted then. So this is known as wasteful competition. Basically, this is known as wasteful competition when competition itself does not become desirable. This is a very good evaluation that you could make against competition as well, by the way, which we will be using this when we will be studying market failure, where we will be talking about how competitive industries are beneficial, socially desirable, and whether, and they always lead to allocative efficiency and productive efficiency. Competitive firms their with the extreme spectrum being the perfect competition, but then the fact that competition is not meant, especially in industries with huge infrastructure costs and machinery costs, where natural monopoly might exist. So competing against a natural monopoly would just result in wasteful duplication of resources. It would result in productive inefficiency and allocative inefficiency as well. And competition in its rational sense would not be desirable. So, and it would not be in the best interest of society. This is how you need to write. This is all what is writing skills. It will not be in the best interest of society to actually compete with a monopoly in that sense, right? And that itself is a big deterrent for any new firm to actually compete against a natural monopolist. So now let's look at other barriers to entry, which fall under the category of legal barriers, basically. And so basically legal barriers, you'll see that there are a lot of, it's a group of barriers, and within these legal barriers you have certain specific barriers. So they are basically imposed by the government, or they are by law. The government has imposed them, or you can say that the government has come up with these rules and regulations and laws, which are backed up by law. And the law asks the firms to do certain things, or it gives them some sort of protection, legal protection, so that other firms cannot copy their products. So these are barriers that the government is safeguarding the interest because of. So for example, let's say a very important and a crucial barrier to entry, or a significant barrier to entry, is patents. And what patent does is that when you have a patent on your product, so for example, if I spend 10 years, my company spends 10 years in researching on how to kill cancer or how to kill HIV, let's say, and after 10 years of hard work, I come up with something based on extensive research and lab testing, I will not want anyone to compete with me, right? Because it's my effort. I will neither want anyone to even know the formula that I'm using, or how is that medicine developed, right? So I can patent my product, I can patent my medicine, which gives me the exclusive right to sell it, and no one can copy that. So for example, GSK owns the patent on Combivir, which is a drug that is used to treat HIV, which gives GSK the sole right to exclude competitors, and only it can produce it. So, and the patent basically gives the monopoly the market power, that is the power to raise the price above cost, and it acts as a barrier to entry. Plus, without the fear that other firms will enter the market, because you see, if the monopoly's product is not patented, let's say, then there is a fear that some entry might be made to compete against, by other firm might also make the same product. So now GSK can only sell Combivir. So if the firm has a patent on the product, then it has sole ownership of something that you have created after research, and so you have developed that, right? So no one can copy you now. So that, in that sense, patents act as a huge source of monopoly power, and they also are a major barrier to entry. Also, other legal barriers to entry would include, the government coming up with laws where you need to obtain expensive licenses that are required to start your business or enter the industry and compete. Another barrier to entry, legal barrier to entry, is when you have strict regulations imposed by the government, such as strict health and safety standards, or strict labor laws, strict hiring and firing laws of the workers. Now, all these, or maybe red tapeism, which includes excessive bureaucracy, you coming up with rules and standards that are unnecessary and rigid. And even though to an extent we can argue that they might have some good interest of society, and the government might have imposed them to protect the society's interest, let's say, or even firms' interest, or let's say the workers' interest, or the consumers' interest, let's say. But but you know, these rules and regulations and strict standards might delay processes, and might be unproductive for firms, or might slow things up. So, in that sense, it can take away the incentive to even enter the market for new firms, right? And they may unnecessarily just increase the cost of production. So, even like unnecessary product standards or planning regulations, right? Or environmental regulations, let's say. So, the higher these legal barriers, the lower the incentive is to enter the market for firms where, um, you know, cost of production in, could just go up because of these barriers, and already coupled with uncertainty, where the uncertainty of competing against a monopoly is already very high, because you're already competing with you are a monopoly, and you are a new firm, you're competing against a monopoly. So there's the uncertainty is already prevalent, and it's already high, right? And the monopoly might come up with, we've already studied like in the previous barrier as well, they might come up with predatory pricing and price you out as well. So all of this will prevent the new firms to enter, especially when you have strict legal barriers, which might just cost you a lot. Cost of production will go up, and coupled with uncertainty can severely deter the entry of new firms and prevent new firms from entering, or let's say restrict fewer firms from entering, and in that sense competition would be restricted. Now, apart from legal barriers, you also have strategic barriers, and these are strategic barriers. Basically, you can also call them artificial barriers, as in the monopolist would artificially or make sure that it imposes it itself, right? And you could say that they include dirty tactics that are played by the monopolist firm or the large incumbent firms, where they will sort of try to act in a way, in a threatening way. They will threaten the mere existence, or they will threaten the entry of the new firms to drive out competition, either to deter entry of new firms, or even if the entry has been made, to just throw them and wipe them out of the market, right? So that's how we use the word dirty tactics, or we are saying strategic barriers, in the sense that the monopoly has a well planned strategy over here to throw them out of the market, or wipe them out, or price them out. And examples of strategic barriers could include predatory pricing. So you can write that down: predatory pricing. And what do you mean by predatory pricing? Predatory pricing means that where your prices are basically the prices that the monopolist will charge. Your prices are charged lower than the profit maximizing price. So maybe you end up charging a loss maximizing price, right? In order to drive out competition. And probably later on, once the competition is wiped out, you might again increase the price. So simple predatory pricing is prices are charged lower than the profit maximizing price, maybe charging a maybe charging a you could say a loss making price, in order to drive the existing competition out. And another strategic barrier that firms or monopolist firm or large incumbent firm could use is known as limit pricing. Now, limit pricing is when you're trying to limit the competition, and where prices are charged at normal profit levels. And when obviously the monopoly will charge a price at normal profit levels, that is when prices are charged by monopolists at normal profit levels, it will wipe out the incentive or take away the incentive for new firms to enter into the market. Obviously no firm is incentivized entry because of normal profits, right? And so that's how threatening monopolists can become, because of using a strategy of pricing, or playing the pricing strategy. to wipe out or price out the competition. And strategic actions could also include, they could also include, apart from just the pricing being the strategic action, it could also include heavy advertising, or you could say, flooding the market with, goods and services, flooding the market with their goods and services. Everywhere you'll see just the monopolist product over there. On every shelf of the store, you will see just the monopolist product over there, right? And advertising in such a heavy way where new firms don't just see their place themselves anywhere in the market. So in order to, and this is done in order to establish, in order to show the new firm that who is the king in the game, right? To establish their dominant position over a new startup firm, basically. That's how you need to put it in the exam. So the existence, remember that the existence or the threat of such strategies, right, might be enough to basically, detract firms from entering the market, thus restricting competition. So now let's look at the number sixth barrier to entry, and that is brand loyalty. So guys, and brand loyalty, or let's say very strong brand loyalty, is a big deterrent for new firms, because you see, entering a market for the new firms where the consumers are already very loyal to big brands is quite risky, right? And the existence of these big firms, with huge and large marketing budgets, may detract the new firms from entering the market, who can obviously not then compete on the marketing spend that these large incumbent firms have in order to create that brand loyalty or awareness of their own product, the way these large incumbent firms have done or are doing, right? And the end result would then be that new firms would be deterred, or they will not enter the market. They may feel threatened that with this sort of brand loyalty they have no space there in the market, right? So the end result is that fewer firms would be entering the market, and obviously that would just restrict competition. So remember, guys, that very high barriers to entry not only stop new firms from entering, but you were also right that they act as the sources of monopoly power. So guys, it's not just the barriers to entry that acts as a source of monopoly power, but in fact there are barriers to exit involved as well in an industry. There might be huge barriers to exit in a particular industry that might act as a deterrent for new firms to enter in the first place, and acting as a big source of monopoly power to maintain the monopoly power of large incumbent firms. So barriers to exit are basically another source of monopoly power, which are obstacles that are preventing the firm to actually exit the market. And since these obstacles are so huge and large, I mean, these obstacles can deter the, in fact, entry of new firms in the first place. For example, there might be huge redundancy costs involved, right, from exiting. So upon leaving an industry, if the firm has to pay, contractually pay, in fact, large redundancy packages for its workers, if it's obviously it's closing down and going out, moving out, then it has to pay, contractually pay large redundancy packages for its workers, then it may actually prevent the firm from leaving an industry. It might not leave the industry then, in order to minimize their costs by instead they'll just continue their production instead. So this is a barrier to entry, a barrier to exit, right? And then the another barrier to exit might be the sale of assets. For example, let's say if a firm owns asset, and if they're exiting, and those assets like those machinery and plant that they cannot agree a good price upon leaving the market, right? They're not getting a good price from selling it when they're leaving the market. For example, the price that is being offered is, let's say, far below the price the firm paid in the first place, let's say. So it's selling the asset in a loss, let's say, in a huge loss, let's say. Then instead they may continue producing, as a way of minimizing their costs. So when you're talking about barriers to exit, and when you're saying that the exit is very costly, so the exit is not taking place, then the fact that exit is costly will deter the exit. And will deter the exit because the firm will continue, but do right that they will continue to they will continue so that they can minimize their cost, because the deterrent was the huge cost involved. So that decision was, revoked in order to minimize their cost by continuing the production instead. The third barrier to entry you can talk about, sorry, the third barrier to exit you can talk about is contractual agreements. So if the firm has contractual agreements, let's say, for gas, electricity, water, so these contractual agreements, there may be large cancellation fees that have to be applied by law, with early contract terminations being made because the firm is leaving, which reduces the viability basically for a firm to leave the industry. Instead, the firm might wait until the contracts have ended before leaving the industry, right? So all of these are basically students' barriers to exit, and they also act as a source of monopoly power apart from just barriers to entry. So I think that's it for this class video, and I'll see you all in the next class. Until then, take care.